Always close with my younger brother Chris. Despite the 6-year age gap between us, we understood each other in ways no one else in the family did. When we were younger, he followed me everywhere, eager to listen to my stories and seek my advice on everything from school to video games. But things changed when I went to college. The distance wasn't intentional, it was just the natural course of life. Daily interactions were replaced by occasional text messages and hurried phone calls. I could hear him growing through his voice, which had deepened over the years, and in the way he talked about his world. This summer was supposed to be our chance to reconnect. My parents, eager for a break, had asked me to look after Chris while they visited some old friends in a nearby town for a week. I expected things to feel the same as before, but when I walked through the front door of our house, keys in hand, I felt a change in the air. Chris had changed. He was no longer the scrawny, wide-eyed boy I had left behind. He had grown taller, his features sharper, his posture more confident. His playful energy had softened into something more reserved. It wasn't just physical, his entire demeanor felt different, more distant. "Hey, stranger." I greeted him with a smile, trying to bridge the gap that had grown between us. "Hey," he replied with a half-smile, a cautious look in his eyes. I ignored it at first, thinking it was just the discomfort of reuniting after so long, or maybe he was going through that phase. Teenagers and their inexplicable moods. That night, as I settled into my old bedroom, I noticed how the house had changed too. My parents had redecorated a bit, new pillows, different curtains, but Chris's room, the one at the end of the hall from mine, felt eerily quiet. When we were younger, I would hear him playing, talking with friends, sometimes even sneaking into my room just to chat when he couldn't sleep. Now there was only silence. Over the next few days, I watched him closely. Something wasn't right with him, not in a bad way, just different. He was calmer than I remembered, his words more measured. He didn't laugh as easily as before, and when he did, it seemed contained, as if he were holding something back. He was still polite, still my little brother, but there was a new weight to him, a quiet intensity that I couldn't quite place. At first, I let it go, focusing on making our time together as normal as possible, cooking dinner, watching movies, reminiscing about childhood memories. He went along with it, but I could feel his distance, as if he were present but his mind was elsewhere. One night, while we were washing dishes together, I decided to address the issue. "You've been quiet," I said, passing him a plate to dry. He shrugged. "Just thinking." "About what?" I pressed. "School life," he replied vaguely, then added, "You're back." I paused, drying my hands with a towel. "I feel like I don't know you anymore." He looked at me then, his dark eyes unreadable. "You left." It wasn't an accusation, but it hit me like one that. I sighed. "I didn't leave you, Chris. Life just happened. College happened." "I know," he said, but something in his tone suggested otherwise. As the days went on, I noticed other things. The way he looked at me when he thought I wasn't watching, the slight tension in his body when I sat close to him on the couch, the way his voice lowered a bit when he said my name. It was subtle but undeniable. One night, we were watching a movie together. The living room was dimly lit, the glow of the screen casting shadows on his face. He sat next to me on the couch, closer than usual. Our shoulders barely touched, but I was acutely aware of the space between us, or the lack of it. At one point, I shifted slightly, and my hand accidentally brushed against his. It was a fleeting touch, nothing significant, but I felt him stiffen beside me. I looked at him, and in that moment, our eyes met. There was something in his gaze, something inquisitive, something hesitant. The air between us changed, and I swallowed, suddenly feeling the need to break the silence. "Are you okay?" He hesitated before nodding.
"Yeah."
But he didn't move, and neither did I. We stayed like that, frozen in the moment, until I couldn't take it anymore. "Chris," I began, my voice barely above a whisper. "What's going on?" He looked away, his jaw clenching. "Nothing. It's just different now." "Different how?" I pressed. He shrugged, but there was a tension in his shoulders that betrayed his casual gesture. "You've been gone for so long. It's like I don't know you anymore either." I reached out and touched his arm, feeling the muscle tense under my fingers. Chris, look at me. He turned to face me, his eyes searching mine. There was a vulnerability in his gaze that I hadn't seen before, a raw honesty that made my heart ache. I'm still your sister, I said softly. No matter what happens, that will never change. He nodded, but there was a sadness in his eyes that made me wonder if he believed me. We finished the movie in silence, the tension between us palpable. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted, something fundamental in our relationship. The next day, Chris asked me to do something I never saw coming. It was a warm summer night, the kind where the air is filled with the scent of grass and the distant hum of crickets. I was curled up on the couch, scrolling through my phone, when Chris walked in. "Hey," he said casually, his hands tucked into the pockets of his hoodie. "Hey," I replied, looking up. He hesitated for a moment, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. "I wanted to ask you something," he began, running a hand through his hair, a nervous habit he hadn't outgrown. I sat up, intrigued. "Go on." He took a deep breath. "There's a party tomorrow night at Jordan's place. Jordan is one of his friends, someone I vaguely remembered from his stories." "Okay," I said, waiting for him to continue. "I was thinking," he paused, then blurted out, "would you go with me?" I blinked, taken aback. "To a high school party? Chris, I'm 23. Don't you think I'll stand out a bit?" He shook his head, a small smile playing on his lips. "Not if you go as my girlfriend." The room fell silent as I stared at him, unsure if I had heard him correctly. "What?" He laughed softly, avoiding my gaze. "Just pretend. Look, there's this girl I used to talk to, and she'll be there with her new boyfriend. Everyone expects me to show up with someone, and I just don't want to look like a loser." I inclined my head, considering his request. It was ridiculous, completely absurd, and yet something in the way he asked, the vulnerability hidden beneath his casual tone, made me pause. I should have said no, but instead, I found myself saying, "Okay, just for the night." His face lit up with relief. "Thank you. It means a lot." The next night, I stood in front of my mirror, smoothing the fabric of my dress. It wasn't anything fancy, just a simple black dress that hugged my figure well. I didn't know why I had spent so much time getting ready. It wasn't like this was real. Yet, my stomach fluttered with a nervous energy I couldn't shake. Chris knocked on my door before poking his head in, his eyes scanning me with something unreadable flickering in his gaze before he smiled. "Wow, you're really committed to this, huh?" I rolled my eyes. "You wanted a fake girlfriend. This is what you get." He stepped into the room, dressed in dark jeans and a fitted shirt that made him look older than his 17 years. His hair was slightly disheveled, as if he had been running his hands through it all night. "Ready?" he asked. I grabbed my bag and nodded. "Let's go." Jordan's house was packed, the music thumping through the walls, and the air filled with the scent of beer and cheap cologne. As soon as we walked in, heads turned. Chris slid his hand into mine, his grip firm but not overbearing. I almost pulled away on instinct but remembered our agreement. His friends noticed us immediately. "Damn, Chris, you actually brought someone." One of them, Caleb, said with a grin as he saw our joined hands. Chris chuckled, squeezing my hand lightly. "Told you I would." Caleb's gaze slid to me and then back to Chris. "She's hot. Where'd you find her?" "College," Chris said smoothly. "We met through a mutual friend." I played along, smiling politely. Chris has been talking about this party for weeks. I had to see what all the fuss was about. Caleb laughed. "Damn, man, you're lucky." I felt Chris's fingers tighten around mine. "Yeah," he murmured, though he was no longer looking at Caleb. He was looking at me. As the night wore on, I played my part well, letting Chris keep his arm around my waist, leaning into him when his friends teased him, laughing at the right moments. But somewhere along the way, it stopped feeling like an act. Maybe it was the way his hand rested on the small of my back, warm and steady. Maybe it was the way his voice softened when he spoke to me, as if he weren't just pretending. Maybe it was the way he looked at me when he thought I wasn't watching, as if he were seeing me for the first time. Or maybe it was the way I found myself looking at him, closer to midnight, when he was quiet for a moment before saying, "Thanks for doing this." I smiled. "Anytime." Silence stretched between us, comfortable but charged. Then, softly, he said, "It doesn't feel fake." I turned to him, my breath catching. He was closer, closer than he should have been, and so familiar, yet so different. "What do you mean?" He shook his head. "I don't know. I just didn't expect it to feel so real." I could have laughed it off, could have brushed it off as nothing more than a silly game, but standing there under the glow of a porch light with Chris looking at me like I was something more than just a sister, I couldn't. I didn't know what this meant, didn't know if it meant anything at all, but for the first time, I wasn't sure I wanted things to go back to the way they were. The night after the party, I lay awake in my bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying the moments over and over in my mind. I had told myself it was just a silly favor for Chris, something harmless, but the way he looked at me when he said it didn't feel fake, that stayed with me. His voice had been quiet, uncertain, as if he were realizing something for the first time. I had felt it too, that strange undercurrent of tension that neither of us had acknowledged. I told myself it was just the excitement of the party, the adrenaline of pretending, but deep down, I knew it was more than that. The next morning, I found Chris in the kitchen, standing by the counter, making coffee. He looked up when he saw me, and for a second, something flickered in his expression, something softer, warmer. "Morning," he said, sliding a cup toward me. I hesitated before taking it. "Morning." He watched me as I took a sip, then smiled. "You know, you looked really good last night." I choked on my coffee. "Oh." He shrugged, but his gaze lingered. "Yeah, I don't think I ever told you that. That's all." But the way he said it, slow and deliberate, as if he wanted to make sure I heard him correctly, made my stomach twist. I let out a small, uncomfortable laugh. "Well, you were a pretty convincing fake boyfriend. Too convincing, maybe." He smiled, but there was something in his eyes that made me pause. "Yeah, maybe too convincing." For a moment, he said nothing, his gaze tilting slightly, as if he were thinking about something he wasn't sure he should say. Then he took his own coffee, taking a slow sip before murmuring, maybe it wasn't all an act. I should have walked away, should have brushed it off as a joke, but I didn't. Instead, I grabbed my coffee and left the kitchen, pretending I hadn't heard him. After that night, things between us began to change. At first, I thought I was imagining it, but then it became impossible to ignore. Chris started acting differently, not just with me, but in general. He carried himself with more confidence, spoke with more certainty. But the biggest change was in how he treated me. It wasn't just the compliments, though those came frequently and casually, as if they had always been a natural part of our conversations. "That dress looks good on you," he would say, even if I was just wearing an old summer dress I had thrown on without thought. "Your hair looks nice like that," he mentioned, even when I had barely brushed it. "You should smile more," he told me one afternoon, completely spontaneously. "It suits you." At first, I tried to brush it off, telling myself he was just being playful, but there was something in the way he looked at me now, something more focused. And it wasn't just the words, it was his actions. Chris started holding doors open for me, always making sure to walk on the side of the sidewalk closest to the street, reaching for things on high shelves without me even having to ask. If we went out together, he would place his hand gently on the small of my back when guiding me through a crowd. His touch was barely there, but perceptible enough to send my heart racing in confused exhilaration. One day, as we were out running errands, a guy in the store casually checked me out. Chris noticed, and his entire posture changed. His shoulders tensed, and there was something in his voice that unnerved me in a way I couldn't define. "Chris," I said, my voice softer now, more assured. He held my gaze for a moment before shaking his head, as if realizing something. "Forget it," he muttered and turned away, but I couldn't forget it. I couldn't because it kept happening. One afternoon, we went to a small cafe in town. Chris had insisted, saying he wanted to get out of the house for a bit, and I thought it was harmless. But when we got there, something shifted. The waitress was around my age, maybe a little older, and she kept smiling at Chris, not just a polite smile, but the kind that lingered, the kind that meant something. And Chris barely noticed. He was too focused on me. I sat there, watching as the strange tension unfolded, a creeping sensation crawling up my spine. Then, As if sensing something, he looked at me, and his entire demeanor changed. He straightened up, shifting his focus entirely to me, as if the waitress no longer existed. She hesitated and then walked away, her smile fading just a bit. I sipped my coffee, keeping my expression neutral. "She liked you," I said, raising an eyebrow. Chris lifted a corner of his mouth in a half-smile. I wasn't paying attention. I rolled my eyes. "Sure, you weren't." But something in the way he said it, his tone playful but his gaze serious, made my stomach twist. He leaned in slightly, resting his arms on the table. "You know," he reflected, "I've never met a girl I enjoy spending time with as much as you." I swallowed hard. "That's because I'm your sister." He tilted his head, his eyes gleaming with something unreadable. "Maybe." But the conversation didn't end there, because later that night, as I sat in my room, looking at my reflection in the mirror, I couldn't shake off the way he had looked at me, the way his voice had sounded. I told myself I was imagining things, that Chris was just being his usual playful self, but deep down, I knew that wasn't true. Because the way he looked at me, it wasn't the way a brother should look at his sister. And the most terrifying part was that I wasn't sure I wanted him to stop. What do you think of the story? How would you handle such a delicate and nuanced situation? Leave your thoughts in the comments. Can love, in its many forms, justify everything, or are there limits that should never be crossed? If you enjoyed this narrative and want to hear more stories like it, subscribe to the channel and hit the bell to be notified of new content. Share it with someone who might want to reflect on themes of love, family, and life's challenges.